All right, we're in our last installment of the Civil War, and now we have finished the war, and now we're going to do what's called Reconstruction. Um, this is a PowerPoint that I'm borrowing from another colleague, and I saw it and I changed a little bit. Some of the key questions that are going to come about through the start of this is, how do we bring the South back into the Union after the war is done? How are we going to rebuild the South after its destruction during the war? The Southern economy has been destroyed. We've got to rebuild it. We've got to bring it back. How do we integrate and protect newly freed slaves into our society? And finally, what branch of government should control the process of Reconstruction? Should it be the executive branch that enforces the laws and the president, or should it be Congress? We're going to have three periods of Reconstruction. One is going to be wartime Reconstruction and President Lincoln. One's going to be presidential Reconstruction, which is going to be his successor in Andrew Johnson. And then we're going to have congressional Reconstruction, which is going to be the radical reformers, the Republicans. And let's take a look at the first one. And wartime Reconstruction was President Lincoln had put together a plan to bring back the South even before the war ended. And his plan was called the 10% plan. And what the 10% plan was he was going to replace the majority rule of the state's voters with a loyalty rule. And he was not going to consult Congress in Reconstruction. Lincoln was a big believer. Now hear this. Lincoln was a big believer in leniency towards the South. He wanted to treat them with kindness. He believed that the Constitution was clear that states could never ever leave and secede from the Union. So even though the southern states, the 13 states had left, he believed, we're not going to punish the states. We're going to punish the highest ranking members of the Confederacy and some of their military generals for the mistreatment of our war criminals, but everybody else is going to be treated with leniency. When 10% of the voting population of a state, of the voting population of 1860, had taken an oath of loyalty, then we would admit them back into the Union. Now, this was in what Lincoln was thinking, that the right way to going about healing a terrible, terrible time in our country's history. But if you were someone who was a staunch believer in abolitionist and a staunch believer in the Union, you'd be saying, wait, we lost a ton of people. 350,000 men died for this cause, and now we're just going to welcome these guys back in? I'm not doing that. These guys are going to pay a price, and we're going to make sure that this never happens again. So we're going to be much more stringent against the South. That's the radical Republican group that are saying, we're not going to just say, hey, all's fine and good, because these people haven't changed their ways. Lincoln will and Lincoln's government will form in 1864 and look to bring back Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Those are the abbreviations of those guys. Those are going to be the first three, because we were already in those states in the war, most of the war. We were in Tennessee, we were in Louisiana and Arkansas, and those were the most easily picked up states within the Confederacy. So we go about using Lincoln's 10% plan of bringing these states back in, and immediately right after, as the war's ending, these guys actually vote to come back into the Union before the war's even over. So again, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas will agree with Lincoln and his 10% rule. And so we're starting the process underneath war reconstruction of rebuilding our country. Lincoln will be killed at the end of the war in April of 1865, and so his plan will be changed dramatically. Now, on the other side of the aisle, remember, Lincoln is a Republican. The Republican Party was the party that was against slavery. The Democrats were for slavery. There was a couple of senators, one in the Senate and a couple of legislators, one in the Senate by the name of Wade and one in the House of Representatives by the name of Davis. And these two guys came up with a bill that was much stronger than what Mr. Lincoln had come up with. They required 50% of all the voters that voted in 1860 to give an ironclad oath of allegiance, swearing that they had never voluntarily aided the rebellion. When you got 50% of all of the people that voted in 1860 to give this oath of allegiance, then they would proceed to start to let them back in. They required the states to have constitutional conventions before the election of state officials, and that safeguards would be enacted to make sure that the free slaves would not be treated poorly. This was much more stringent than what Mr. Lincoln was looking for. The Wade-Davis bill passed Congress, both houses, soundly, but Lincoln was able to give a pocket veto to it. And I'm not going to go into it because we don't have a lot of time, but it's basically a way of killing a bill at the end of a legislative session. So he never even had to vote on it. He just killed it. This ironclad oath that they wanted, this belief that the state suicide theory, that we're not going to allow the South to just continue down the road of their ways, that they were going to stop that, and they were going to adhere to what the North had given them. And it ends up being a pocket veto for Lincoln. The 13th Amendment will be adopted into the Constitution. The supreme law of the land is the Constitution. The only way you can change the Constitution is by adopting an amendment. And one of the arguments that the Southern Democrats were saying in the South is that there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits slavery. Well, at the end of the Civil War, the Constitution and the Republican Party, the radical Republicans, are going to introduce an amendment that will strictly be put in place. And this will be done in December of 1865. Back up a second, Lincoln was killed in April of 65. His successor, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, will come in December of 1865. The Congress, which is controlled predominantly by Republicans are against slavery, introduced the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment says slavery or non-involuntary servitude. Someone who is not a slave, but an involuntary, someone who has servitude. So this was something we did. You would, back in colonial times, you'd have somebody say, I can't afford to come over to the New World, so I'll give you 3 years or 2 years or 4 years of servitude for you to pay my way over to the New World. Both of those were now considered to be a crime. You could not have slavery or involuntary servitude. Actually, you could on a very slim basis. The government could still actually do this, but we're not going to get into that because we don't have time, but it's an interesting topic to go over. This is going to abolish, the 13th Amendment will abolish slavery. And then Congress, the big part about this is Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So it's telling you that Congress, if you're going to say, I'm not going to allow blacks to vote, then we're going to come in. If you're not going to allow blacks to live freely in your society, then we're going to come in and we're going to pass laws. And those laws are going to incarcerate. It's going to put you in jail. It may even take away all your property. We're not going to let you treat the African American as a slave anymore. After the Civil War, the radical Republicans put in place to help the newly freed slaves and black man what's called a Freedmen Bureau. And Freedmen Bureau is a group of Northerners that would go down and give these slaves opportunities. Many of these people were abolitionists who risked everything to go down to the South and to enforce these laws. These laws were passed by the Congress that told the South you had to do these things for the black, the African American. Well, the South isn't going to do it. And the local enforcement, the sheriff, the governor, oftentimes were not going to do it. So these guys went down there with the federal government's power to say, no, you can't act that way. Many of these Northerners that went to the South were called carpetbaggers. That's one of the terms I would make sure I know for the test. White Southern Democrats hate these guys. They don't believe in what they're saying. They don't like being told what to do, and consequently, this goes on. Now, Lincoln is now gone, so the war's ended. So the wartime Reconstruction ends, and now presidential Reconstruction will come about. Andrew Johnson, who is Mr. Lincoln's vice president, this is an interesting one. Lincoln, as I mentioned to you guys before, Lincoln appoints a lot of his adversaries to key positions. Mr. Stanton, Edwin Stanton, will be someone who does not like Mr. Lincoln, will become the Secretary of War. Today he'd be called the Secretary of Defense. You have William Seward is his Secretary of State, who is a guy that really doesn't like Lincoln and who he ran against for the nomination of the Republican Party. Andrew Johnson is a Democrat. Now, he is a Democrat who believes in the Union, but he's a white supremacist who doesn't believe that the black man should have the right to have equal power. But he is a strong believer in the Union. He's an interesting combination. Andrew Johnson is a Jackson Democrat, Jacksonian Democrat. He's very much opposed to the rich elite group of these slave landowners that have huge plantations. He can't stand these guys. He believes these guys are the ones that actually brought us to war. He is a white supremacist, which is a really unique thing to have as a president. He agreed with Lincoln that the states had never really officially left the Union, but he makes the statement of damn the Negroes, I'm fighting these traitorous aristocratic masters of the South. That's who he's going after. President Johnson's plan is more or less the same as what Lincoln offered. He said to the states that had left that if you give an amnesty of a simple oath to the Union, that you would be allowed to come back in. Only the Confederate civil and the military officers would be held in underneath the law. They would be brought to trial. So the main generals and most of those guys, most of the civil people, the governors and that had broken away, they would be brought in. And then those with property over $20,000. Well, then again, those are those rich aristocratic aristocratic landowners that he was going to go after. Those guys. So military men, the governors, the mayors, those kinds of people, and then the really rich elite people. Those guys were all going to be held in contempt, and he could give pardons to them if he wanted to, but all the other Southern people were going to be allowed back in. Well, this is not going to go well with the radical Republicans. They are not in favor of this at all. The new constituents had to accept a minimum of conditions. They had to repudiate, meaning they had to do away with slavery and the fact that they had seceded, and they had to take on their own state debts. He would appoint provisional governors over the confederacies. This is going to cause a couple of things. First of all, the South is going to like Johnson. They're going to think that he's one of their guys. The Northerners and the Republicans are going to feel like they were sold out by their president. And what Johnson ends up doing is he says, okay, we're gonna hold a lot of these people in contempt, but he's like Lincoln. He's saying, let's get past this point. So he hands out a ton of pardons, and a lot of these guys just simply go back into being exactly what they were before the war started. So people that had the power end up being the same people that have the power. They haven't changed their views. And the Republicans are going to see this as nothing more than we're going to go right back in the same situation we were in 4 years ago, because the Southerners haven't learned their lesson. They can't treat the black as a piece of property. Black codes were set up by the South, and the black codes were to guarantee that the newly freed black men and women were never going to be treated equal. They wanted to restore pre-emancipation systems for race relations. So it would go white first, black second. And it forced many blacks into becoming what's called sharecroppers. And this is another form of slavery, really. Sharecropping is where the white guy, the big land-owning aristocrat would come in and say, I'll let you work on my farm. I will pay you my money. I wouldn't pay you in dollars, but I would pay you in my currency. So it'd be, in my case, Mr. Murphy dollars. And Mr. Murphy dollars can only be redeemed at Mr. Murphy's store. And I now wouldn't have to pay for your housing, and I wouldn't have to feed you. You'd have to feed yourself with Mr. Murphy dollars, and you could redeem those at my store, and I would charge you huge prices, and you'd live in poverty, and you couldn't go anywhere else because no place else in the South would accept African Americans. Well, these black codes are nothing more than another form of slavery. Now, Congress will see what's happening in the South, and congressional reconstruction will begin here. Congress is Republicans who are against slavery. So it's somewhat of what we have today with President Trump and his belief as the direction of the country contrasts with the Democrats and the progressives who believe something very differently. There is a clash of ideas here. Congress will say, no, we're not going to accept these black codes. We're not going to accept this Reconstruction underneath President Johnson, and they're going to bar all Southern congressional delegates from entering Congress again. President Johnson will veto when the bill is passed about Freedmen's Bureau. Remember, Freedmen's Bureau is a way to help African Americans to be integrated into the newly freed country. He's going to put this in place, and President's going to veto it. Well, you can override a veto with 2/3 of a majority of the House and Senate. And this is going to be the first time in our country's history that a presidential veto is going to be overridden. Johnson will also veto the 1866 Civil Rights Act that was trying to set up treatment for African Americans as being fair and equal. And this is going to be a big deal. Again, Congress is going to pass both bills over Johnson's vetoes. First time in U.S. history. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the radical constructionists. This is the Republicans. Republicans are against slavery. They're really upset. Democrats were for slavery and for the way that the South was going to treat the blacks. 14th Amendment was ratified in July of 1866, and it provided a constitutional guarantee that rights and security of all people would be free. It's going to stop this Southern belief system that you can treat blacks poorly. So the 14th Amendment is going to be providing that all Americans be treated and cannot be they cannot be persecuted based on race, color, creed, your religion. Southern states would be punished for denying the right to vote to black citizens. So the 14th Amendment is going to say, you Southern states that are trying to stop blacks from being allowed to vote and being able to serve on certain committees like a jury or certain parts of the society, we're going to punish you. We're going to put you in jail. We're going to take your rights away. We're going to fine you. The radical plan for readmission was that the civil authorities in the territories were subject to all, the military would oversee all of the Southern civil authorities. And if they weren't acting right, they would imprison these Southern authorities. They required that all the new state constitutions have black suffrage, the right to vote, and the ratification of the 13th and 14th Amendment. Congress passed this act and authorized the military to enroll eligible black voters and to begin the process of constitutional making. President Johnson will be impeached. President Johnson is going to be impeached, the first president to ever be impeached. There have been 2 presidents that have been impeached, Andrew Johnson, the 17th president of the United States, and Bill Clinton, the 44th president of the United States, I believe. Johnson removed Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War, because Stanton was really upset with the way that Johnson was treating the Southern states. He believed that he wasn't treating the Southern states with a staunch enough, hard enough hand, that we weren't doing anything to the Southern states. We were allowing them to come back into our union without paying the price. They will try to replace them, and the radical Reconstructionists, the Republicans will look to impeach Andrew Johnson, and they will in fact impeach him on February 24th. there will be a trial. And remember now, when the president is impeached, that doesn't mean that he's done anything wrong. That just means he's being brought up for trial. He's brought before trial. It lasts for 11 weeks, but Johnson is acquitted. You need 2/3 of the Senate vote to actually enforce the articles of impeachment against the president. They came up one vote short. Bill Clinton, they needed 66, and I think Bill Clinton, in his impeachment, there was like 54. So they were 12 votes short against Clinton and 1 vote short against Andrew Johnson. The 15th Amendment will be adopted and ratified in 1870, excuse me. And this is saying that no one can be denied the right to vote based on their race. So they were stopping. This is going to happen in the Republicans' belief that they were going to be stopped, that the Southern Democrats, after the 1868 election, where Ulysses S. Grant is elected primarily by African Americans in the South, and they felt like the Southern senators were going to try to stop blacks from ever voting again. So the 15th Amendment was put in place, and the 15th Amendment completely stops the stoppage of someone not being allowed to vote based on their race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Again, if you try to stop somebody because of the color of their skin, we're going to throw you in jail. Now, this is going to make women's rights groups in 1870 start saying, wait a minute, you're going to allow slaves to vote, but not us. And this is going to put in motion the right for women to vote, which will come about in 1920. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and we're going to finish up the rest of this lecture when we come back next time, just before the test. And then we'll take a look at this real quickly, and then we will move into our test. Okay?